I should say this is the first of this term's master's evenings in the lodgings. It's the only one, so it's a very special one. It's special in other ways. Normally, as you know, we have two sort of people talking about their research, and a scientist and an arts person. And indeed, if I can, before I start, announce that next term we will be having 2 evenings with names like Peach, Rosenberg, Wallen participating, and others. This term we've decided something rather different, because we have this opportunity to hear from Patrick Nairne what originally was going to be exactly what happened 50 years ago to this very night in Alamein. It turned out that there was some inaccuracy in the dates, and it's not quite true, but it's very nearly true. And I can't think of anything more exciting than nowadays it's hard to believe that then there were young people in their 20s going off fighting, dying in the desert. I mean, it's just so different from the world we've been brought up in. I gather that Sir Patrick's not the only Nairne to be talking today. Many of you will have heard on the radio Sandy was speaking. Did you know? Yeah. TV, so well, we very that's right. Well, I don't think he needs an introduction, so I'll just say, please, Pat, we really look forward to a unique opportunity for us to hear this fascinating story.
Master, thank you. You've been far too kind. Well, Master, Lord Ladybrook, friends, it's really extraordinarily nice for you to come. To come to hear what is inescapably, very largely, an ego trip, starting half a century ago. Because in mid-November, 50 years ago, 1942, I was a very junior officer in the Seaforth Highlanders. I was intelligence officer of the 5th Caithness and Sutherland Battalion of the Seaforth Highlanders, which was one of 9 infantry battalions of the 51st Highland Division, which had arrived out in Egypt in August 1942. And at this moment, 50 years ago, we were technically resting. We were actually slowly on the move westwards. We were somewhere between a small place called Alamein and Tobruk. We were somewhere there. I've always been fascinated, haven't you, about these battle names. How places like Alamein or Culloden or Flodden Field or Blenheim, nobody could possibly put their finger on a map and say where they are. And yet they're great names of history. And so this small railway station in the western desert called El Alamein. And we were resting because really it had turned out, it was one of those chance events, my brigade, consisting of my own battalion, the 5th Seaforths, the 2nd Battalion of the Cannons, 5th Cannon Battalion, one brigade out of 3 brigades of the Highland Division, had actually played the decisive part that brought about the victory at Alamein a fortnight earlier. Now, 52 years ago, I was a freshman at this university. I was reading classical mods at Univ. I'd come up in the Trinity term, thinking it over. I suppose they were desperately after getting what fees they could, so they allowed in wartime anybody to come up who was prepared to come up, or their school and their family would release them. It was Trinity term 1940. Just before term had begun, the Germans had invaded Denmark and Norway. As term gathered pace, Belgium and Holland were invaded. The British Expeditionary Force were forced out of Northern Europe through Dunkirk. The High, I can vividly remember, was filled with soldiers, black in the faces, standing around in the sun, waiting to be taken off by small boats on the Dunkirk beaches, who were living in camps on Port Meadow, slowly being sorted out as to what units they really belonged to. And I vividly remember a week or two later, I suppose it might have been 2 or 3 weeks later, walking up after lunch to Carfax, and there were several placards up saying Paris had fallen. And I felt the real war had occurred, and Oxford was very unreal. And I wrote a letter to the master, Sir William Beveridge, who was master at Univ, and said, could I leave, and would it matter if I left and joined the army? And after some weeks' delay, these things always take time, I had a letter saying that was all right. Well, I had acquired at Oxford something called Certificate B in the Officer Training Corps, which was based just up the road as it is today. It was a rather extraordinary certificate, derived from showing the absolute minimum military potential, doing something called tactical exercises without troops on Boar's Hill. And of course, we were desperately short of officers by then, or feeling we soon would be. So those who had this certificate called Certificate B, one got Certificate A at school. Certificate B could go or would be sent straight to an officer cadet training unit. And sure enough, in November 1940, I was sent to an officer cadet training unit, Octu 166, in the Isle of Man. Nasty, dirty November evening, very nasty crossing. There was I in civvies, civilian clothes, surrounded by a lot of other soldiers who'd been in the army some time, who were also coming to cadet training. And we found ourselves, incidentally, in an island that perhaps not many of you here know. I didn't know. I thought it was a rather bleak and flat bit of Lancashire, but it turned out, of course, to be a lovely little slice of Ireland. And after a few months, 4 months, in the spring of 1941, I sort of came out of the Octu egg and was commissioned as a second lieutenant. My father, as it happened, had been a professional soldier for 25 years. He'd retired, long since retired by the time the war broke out. And so I did apply to be commissioned at his regiment, the Seaforth Highlanders. And in March 41, I found myself sent up to Fort George, which is the depot, the Seaforth Highlanders, on the Murray Firth. So 6 months after leaving Oxford, where I'd been a very wimpish, absolutely bottom of the heap fresher and unit, I'd become an equally wimpish, bottom of the heap second lieutenant at Fort George, the depot on the Murray Firth. And for those who might be amused, there's a photograph of wimpish now, looking rather different to the old man you can see in front of you now. Photograph for the benefit of my dear old mum. And during 1941, I suppose I learned a certain amount, gathered a bit of maturity, sent on a course, I remember, in Edinburgh, where I did have the experience that other people were having of the real of the Luftwaffe and London, Coventry, and the big cities, from which one had been totally preserved in the Isle of Man, and indeed was very preserved on the Murray Firth. But when I was on a course in Edinburgh, I think it must have been May 41, of course there was a lot of bombing there, and I did have the experience that others had much more of that. And then I can remember, rather oddly, this is the way one gathered one's training, sent on 3 rather odd jobs. One to the island of Lewis to start up the first unit of the RAF regiment to protect the Coastal Command air station at Stornoway. And then I'd hardly got back from that when I was sent to a place called Elgin to be temporary adjutant to the 1st Murray Battalion Home Guard, because the proper adjutant, who had been a sort of dugout from the First World War, had fallen down dead drunk outside the Gordon Arms and broken his arm. And the commanding officer, who himself was a retired general of the First World War, had simply rung up the commanding officer of the depot and said, send the young officer who knows how to write to be the adjutant for a month. So I had the experience of rushing all around one of the most lovely parts of Scotland, Murrayshire, looking at Home Guard companies under training in the evening. And then I was actually sent back to Lewis for a period, in the light of that, to train the Home Guard for a period, and was rather astonished to find that most of the companies of the Home Guard in the island of Lewis were commanded by Presbyterian ministers. The real enemy, of course, was the company 3 or 4 miles away down the road. And they were only concerned, as far as I was there, was whether I could give them a bigger box of grenades than I'd given the other lot. And here I was, age 20, I'd never seen a shot fire in anger, extremely green and wet everywhere. But in November, I was then sent a little bit nearer where it all happens. When I joined an active service unit, the battalion I mentioned, the 5th Case Medicine Southern Battalion of the Seaforth Highlanders, in the Highland Division, which was then in the northeast of Scotland. It was the 2nd Highland Division, because the 1st Highland Division had been totally put in the bag, taken prisoner, at the end of the France campaign. They'd been failed to get off at a place called St. Valerie, really rather a tragic story. And there we had a very cold winter in 1941, which just 1 or 2 of you here may remember. And we put up tubular scaffolding against an improbable invasion threat near Peterhead. And we rushed around in big exercises based on First World War scenarios throughout the countryside. That was all pretty strenuous. I was mightily relieved when I was appointed intelligence officer of the battalion. I think very much on the basis I gather this Mr. Nairne at university should know how to hold a pencil and a pen. And this was, brought me back to head office, so to speak, headquarters in Stonehaven, or whatever headquarters amounts to in an infantry battalion. And during that period of time, once again, we were rather conscious up there in the northeast of Scotland that things were pretty dire in the real war. At the beginning of the year, you may remember, just to remind you as to where we are, there had been one or two successes in the Western Desert under Wavell against the Italians. There is a rather well-known quotation, I think, from the Summerfields School magazine, which people occasionally quote, where Wavell was, "Wavell minor is doing well in North Africa." But later on, of course, Rommel arrived quite soon after that, and we were thrown back there, partly, of course, because Churchill had decided to send British forces to Greece and to Crete, from which we were very quickly thrown out by the Germans. The RAF were very gallantly undertaking bombing raids with very considerable casualties over Germany. The Battle of the Atlantic was well underway, and German submarines were taking their toll. And then in June, Germany invaded Russia and had really very considerable success, remarkable success in the early stages of that. And then later in the year, there came Pearl Harbor and the surrender of Hong Kong, and the last ghastly moments for the ex-First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, when the Prince of Wales and the Repulse were both sunk in an hour or two, and eventually the fall of Singapore. And it was a low moment. I only say this is background to the need for a victory in 1942. But of course, we had been joined as allies by Russia, and we had been joined as allies by the United States. And it's just possible that one or two others in the room remember that Winston was advised, chose himself, because he did used to learn a lot of poetry, to choose the only poem by Clough, which anybody knows, as far as I'm concerned, I think, "Say not the struggle naught availeth," in his great end of sort of year speech, of which the last verse, you see, is extraordinarily appropriate about both the Russians and the Americans. So you know how "Say not the struggle naught availeth" is the opening verse, but the last verse goes, "And not by eastern windows only, when daylight comes in the light." You hear Churchill's voice. "When daylight comes in the light. In front the sun climbs slow, how slowly, but westward look, the land is bright." And, well, maybe it was, but it wasn't particularly bright, I may say, in early 42. But in spring 42, we got away from the snows of northeast Scotland and came down to England, because it was very clear we'd been identified as one of the divisions that should go abroad. And it was easier, apparently, to kit us up and get us, make sure we had all the right transport and all that kind of thing. Down in southeast England, we were based in Hampshire, and we were visited by the King and Queen, a sure sign that some ghastly mission awaited. And a battlefield was set up, and where do you think it was but in Sherman Park, a few miles west of Burford. And of course these Scotsmen were absolutely thrilled. Primroses out, I remember the daffodils was out. I was sent on the course there. And of course the pubs, they hadn't seen pubs, you know, the whiskey-ridden Scottish bars. They didn't know what an English pub was really like. And if the beer was a bit watered, it was beer there. And so we pulled ourselves together, and then in June we were all put into a succession of trains, and the whole of the Highland Division was moved back from Hampshire, back up to Gurrock, up in the Clyde, where we were embarked in a huge convoy. And the 5th Battalion and the Battalion of the Gordon Highlanders and the Gunner Regiment, we were all put in a dreadfully clapped out Norwegian cruise liner, absolutely filled with bedbugs. That's really what I remember. We were frightfully bitten very quickly. And we started off on a journey we didn't know where. I mean, there was no disclosure as to where we were going. We had some idea that it might conceivably have been hot because we'd been equipped with topies. And on June the 20th or 21st or thereabouts, we set off. And I kept a rather jejune diary I found when I was preparing this little talk. And I see I wrote, "Sunday the 21st of June, on the move at last. We have to sleep in our clothes for the first 4 days while we're still within range of the German Focke-Wulf bombers stationed in northern France." And then the following day, the 22nd of June, 1942, "I feel that in a day or two I shall have enough boat drill for life. They don't hide from us the critical nature of these few days. It only takes a bomber 3 minutes to sink a ship the size of this one." We heard last night that Rommel had captured Tobruk with 25,000 prisoners. It's still unconfirmed, but bad news is almost always true. I wonder if it will make any difference to our destination. And I kept this not terribly exciting diary on, and I find that on Saturday, August the 1st, by then, we'd stopped off. Part of the division had stopped in at Cape Town, and part had stopped in at Durban. Wonderful moment, I may say, if we'd been in England during those years, to find all the lights lit up, restaurants working. The Scots all turned out to be welcoming to this Highland division. After that, we were told that we were probably bound for Egypt. Though I think the territories will start probably go to India, or whether we should go to the Persian Gulf area, because the Russians were then threatening that part. The Germans were threatening into Egypt. And I write down for Saturday, August the 1st, very hectic lately, mainly due to exercise Cairo, map exercise run by the commanding officer. He emphasizes we've much to learn: desert formations, field navigation, astronomy, hygiene, camouflage, army tank cooperation. And I do remember my commanding officer, awfully nice man, but terribly eager beaver, became obsessed about the stars. I quote him here: "The stars will be pretty useful in the desert, Patrick. I want you to go up on the bridge when Captain Green goes up and learn all about them." So I write down here, so poor George Green, who I may say was a wonderful man, went all the way through the war, was a primary school teacher from Caithness. George Green, I sweat in the charts room, trying to look intelligent, say the right thing for up to an hour. You can recognize the stars in the sky, right, but to plot your own position from them, we found a very different story. But I must tell you at once, I never made the slightest use of stars in the desert. On the contrary, they used to make use of me, because I used to be very homesick. I can remember coming back home from a party where we lived near Winchester. You could stand on the steps of our house, which is on a hill, and on the starry night you could look up and see the bear, the pole star, and those sort of stars that I can identify. And of course in the desert you do exactly the same thing, and it reminded you of doing it back home. So in the second week of August, 8 weeks after we had left the Clyde, we arrived at Suez. And on my 21st birthday, the 15th of August 1942, we disembarked and moved by train to a tented camp west of the Suez Canal, very raw, sweating, anxious, desperately harassed by flies everywhere. The camp had obviously been used over some years. It's absolutely fly-ridden. And very soon we were all decimated by jippy tummy. You can easily guess what that was. We certainly didn't feel quite up to the destiny that clearly awaited us as one of the units in the 8th Army. Well, the great man of destiny himself, Churchill, as it happened, arrived back in Cairo. I say back in Cairo because, as I should explain, he'd been there a short time before. He arrived back from his first trip to Moscow, where he'd gone with a party of VIPs that had filled no less than 3 aircraft. And he was finishing his first rather difficult visit, and you must read Alan Book on his first visit to Moscow, or read Churchill's own account. Now, I'm not sure, Alan, whether it's you who quote him or Winston himself quotes himself as saying that he had very little good news at that point, as you can see from what I've reminded you. Very little good news to bring Stalin. It was like, as he said, carrying a lump of ice to the North Pole. Well, he had been, before he went there, he had been to Egypt. He'd been to Egypt because the situation had, as you realize from my telling you that we had heard ourselves of the fall of Tobruk, the whole situation of the 8th Army had become very desperate, and desperate decisions were needed. So Winston Churchill himself, with his huge party, had looked in on Egypt en route to Moscow. And at this point, I think it might be useful if I actually circulate some of these small maps here. We've got quite a lot of paper there.
We have half round.
Yeah. So we put around that side. We've got a few around. Right. Well done. Thank you. So. Well, I just wanted to say at this point, take a look at the map. What had happened? You can see Tobruk now. Tobruk is separated from Alamein by about just sort of 400 miles, that sort of distance. And after the fall of Tobruk, our forces, very demoralized, have fallen back, but under considerably leadership by General Auchinleck, who was commanding the 8th Army, they'd managed to stem the advance at this, up till then, totally unknown place called Alamein. And you can see why they'd been able to do it by just looking at that map, because there's a distance of about 40 miles, 40 to 50 miles, between the sea, the Mediterranean, and what's called the Qatada Depression, which is a great series of salt pans over which vehicles simply couldn't go. And there one managed to halt the Africa Corps, bearing in mind that by then we had the enormous advantage of a logistic base very close behind us, 40 miles or so behind us, in the Cairo and Suez Canal area, whereas Rommel's forces were thousands, really a long distance away from, they were 1,200 miles away from Tripoli, although no doubt they were quickly trying to get Tobruk into use. They depended on a long line of communication for ammunition, for food, for petrol above all, no doubt, for petrol. And there really the army was halted in a rather good position. But the morale of the army was extraordinarily bad, and Churchill had already decided in London on the advice of his Chief of the General Staff, General Alan Brooke, that he got to make changes. So Auchinleck, the commander of the 8th Army, was moved quite soon after. It wasn't decided straight away where to go, but he eventually became Commander-in-Chief of India. 3 other generals were sacked altogether. General Alexander, very dapper, debonair, calm, cool man, who'd done very well in the war, guardsman, came in. He'd been absolutely top of the pops with Churchill throughout the war, and after the war, I may say. Came in as Commander-in-Chief, and the commander of the 8th Army was given to the best of the desert commanders, a man called Gott, General Gott, G-O-T-T. Well, Gott was pretty worn out, and he was given a few days' leave. But as he flew back from the desert to Cairo for leave, he was shot down by the Germans. And this was a bit of tragic good luck, because his death meant that in Montgomery, who had been actually already identified as a commander for something I shall mention later on, a landing much further west in North Africa, was immediately flown out to take command of the 8th Army. Well, we all heard about this. It was all quite new to us as we settled into this fly-ridden camp in the Canal area. And we also heard Winston himself. We were herded within a day or two of arrival into an old corrugated iron cinema. We weren't told who was going to speak to us, so we all started to guess. And then I can remember we were crowded really rather shoulder to shoulder. In came this puffy, pale-faced old man, looking to me, or somebody of my generation, like an American comic actor called W.C. Fields. And he did look absolutely, not surprisingly, absolutely worn out. And he nevertheless quickly engaged in a bit of his rhetoric. And he told us we've got, these great new commanders. Well, we knew nothing about them. Alexander and Monty, not unrecently, had never been up to Scotland. And, but we very quickly learned that they were good news. Montgomery, who was always to be a Cromwellian hero to some people and an arrogant self-publicist to others, was unquestionably the right man for the particular job at that particular moment. Rommel was at that time, in mid-August, poised to launch another major attack. Cairo was clearly in a panic. We ourselves, as I say, fairly low ebb, desperately out of training in every way. We ourselves were exposed to Seaforth officers who had been serving in various staff jobs in the desert, coming back to us and telling us terrifying stories really of German Stuka bombers, and in particular their 88mm guns, which could open fire with great effectiveness before our tanks were in range to open fire back at them. And it was very clear things were at a very low ebb. And Monty arrived, as you will hear shortly. I've got a bit of video to show in a minute, with his great cry, "There'll be no more bellyache. We stand here and we shall move forward." Well, on the 24th of August, we ourselves drove as a great divisional convoy all the way through the streets of the Egyptian capital, making great chaos, I may say, designed, I think, to impress the populace of Cairo that another great fresh division had arrived to reinforce the situation. and we settled in a new camp just west of the pyramids. And I remember, I suppose, anxious as to where Rommel's attack, expected in a few days, might take him. I stumped round the pyramids and the Sphinx one afternoon with my commanding officer and the chief staff officer of the brigade, looking for defensive positions in and around the pyramids. But of course, the Middle East area is the Middle East area, and after that, I may say, we repaired what I think is still there, the Mina House Hotel. It had a very agreeable iced lemon, sort of lemon impressive. It was very good before we returned to our very hot camp. But a day or two later, we moved some 40 miles, vehicle on vehicle, through clouds of sand and dust to the main reserve positions of the 8th Army, which is some 10 miles behind the front line, with the object of us spending a period of time, provided the attack was beaten off and we weren't involved in it, because there was no desire whatsoever to commit the Highland Division to any fighting at that stage. We simply weren't fit for it. Our job was to make ourselves desert worthy. And I did find, again, preparing for this, I did find somewhere, I said you could find things in one's home, a letter, the only letter my mother ever kept, that I wrote later on December the 6th, 1942, after the Battle of Alamein was over. But there is a section here that describes this, and a letter written at the time, even if it's not a very good letter, perhaps carries a little bit more credibility. I wrote, it was hot when we landed at Suez. There was dust, watermelon, starlit nights, jiffy tummy. We lived in tents. We went marching before breakfast and marching after dark. We were supposed to siesta after midday, but we never had time. There were lectures by desert rats of several campaigns' experience. We still wore topies. We scrubbed our equipment white and learnt to wear our compasses in their pouches permanently on our belt. Then we moved into the desert. We practiced our compass work, discarded our topies, never to put them on again, I may say, visited the pyramids on duty, and started our months of training, during which our average stay in one locality was 5 days. We experienced a dust storm where visibility was 5 yards, learnt to dig the trench in which you could sleep, be protected from bombs and shells. We introduced to anti-tank mines, knew what it was to dig your truck out of soft sand 6 times in 2 miles. The days passed. It's an extraordinary thing about the desert. You may actually know the date, but you never know what day of the week it is. One day is so like another. Stand until 5:15, breakfast at 7 o'clock, tin bacon and beans, bread, usually biscuits though, and marmalade tea, and then the business of the day, always a multitude of jobs for the intelligence officer. Open quote, the battalion may be moving by this way to so-and-so, I want you to recce the route as far as some place or other. Or our unit signs aren't up to standard, Mr. Nairne. I want you to get the battalion headquarters ones repainted. My commanding officer is absolutely passionate. The sign was absolutely right. You know, he was a great one for sort of whitewashing the coal buckets. The intelligence officer will be responsible for forming up the column for the move this evening, and that kind of thing. We worked hard, I wrote, during those weeks. We saw hard sand, soft sand, scrub, rocks, tracks, roads. We were like schoolboys being rushed through a crammer in order to pass a common entrance for battle. And we did, in the way, settle down to a life of sleeping in a trench with a bivouac stretched across the top to prevent the dew in the early morning, cooking in a section of half a dozen men who had a half an old petrol tin and you threw sand into it and some petrol into that and lit it. You cooked your bacon on that. And we had 2 pints of water a day each for drinking and washing. And in some ways it was really rather agreeable. I can remember one evening doing one of these moves, we were all packed up, and I really felt so chuffed. Everything one had in life was there in this truck. You didn't have to bother about anything. Nothing else, no other possessions. You didn't quite know where you were going, but nevertheless, it was, in a way, rather fun, and a lot of other people were doing it with you. Well, our desert indoctrination was completed by a very good idea. We were seconded to the 9th Australian Division. They'd been out a bit before us and were extremely good. They came from South Australia most often. I went and lived with the intelligence officer in the intelligence section of a battalion of the 9th Australian Division who were holding the line, the front line. And they were just what we needed. They showed us that even under the worst conditions, you could be remarkably cheerful and enjoy life. They were, I suppose we were 2,000 yards away from the enemy. There was certain amounts of shelling going on, but it was reasonably quiet. And as far as they were concerned, the most important thing of the day was to make certain you had a bathe in some of the best bathing in the world, which is the Mediterranean coast. Wonderfully warm turquoise sea, white rocks and sand. It's absolutely delightful. So that did us quite a lot of good. Well, while we were becoming desert worthy, Monty had been enormously heartened by the success of beating off this attack from Rommel, which had been expected at the end of August, and indeed took place in the first day or two of September, where we had good intelligence as to what he was actually going to seek to do. We had a great many guns of the Royal Horse Artillery dug in. We dug in a great many of our tanks. Rommel's own tanks came into this, and a great deal of them were destroyed. We certainly, it wasn't a defeat as far as he was concerned, but it was a very major withdrawal. He'd had a bloody nose, and he withdrew. And it gave enormous confidence, I think, that we now had a commander in Montgomery who knew what he was doing. And certainly as far as Monty was concerned, having succeeded in that, he was ready to devote quite a long time to resisting the endless pressure from Prime Minister Churchill to launch a major attack extremely soon. He was determined not to do so till these new divisions, which included us, it was also the 44th Division, which had come from Sussex, south of England, and the Australians themselves hadn't been out all that long. He was determined that we should have more practice, and he was determined to wait until he had enough of what the Americans had generously been giving us, which was Sherman tanks, better tanks with better tank guns. Our tank guns, indeed our tanks, were very, very bad throughout the war. And at this point, I think, Priscilla, we want to have a very short bit of video film. It starts, I may say this, I woke up, say, come on, let's video it, when I was looking at a film which was on the 23rd of October recently. And so it suddenly, we turned it on. Yeah. It suddenly jumps in to the voice of Montgomery. But you see a little bit of what Alamein looked like, Alamein Station looks like, and I'll give a shout as to when we should stop it, because it won't go on very long.
Right.
Yeah.
Watched off.
Whole atmosphere.
There's Monty.
I do not like the general atmosphere I find here. It is an atmosphere of doubt. Of looking back to select the next place to which to withdraw. The loss of confidence in our ability to defeat Rommel. All that must cease at once. We must have a new atmosphere. The defense of Egypt lies here, at Alamein. Here we will stand and fight. There will be no further withdrawal. There's been a good deal of belly aching out here. All that's to stop at once. I'll tolerate no belly aching. We will stand and fight here. If we can't stay here alive, then let us stay here dead. Now again.
Monty's arrival was absolutely electrifying. He told us exactly what we wanted to hear. He waved a paper to us and said, "This is what the Prime Minister gave me. My mandate. Got Rommel for 6 out of Africa and so on."
I want to impress on everyone that the bad times are over. They are finished. Our mandate from the Prime Minister is to destroy the Axis forces in North Africa. It can be done, and it will be done.
Within days, Rommel flung 70,000 troops and 500 tanks into the attack. But the Africa Corps had met its match. The Battle of Alamein destroyed Rommel's hopes of breaking through to Cairo.
It was the first time, I think, that we'd ever seen
The well-known voice.
German armour turn tail. This little man had said what would happen, and it turned out pretty well according to plan. And I think that the result of Alamein was that it strengthened the belief in his generalship.
New equipment and fresh troops from the port of Suez began to reach the Eighth Army. Monty had won a critical defensive battle. Now it was time to attack.
By this time, we've all started to call him master, because he very much established himself. And he walked up and down, looking just like Napoleon, with his hands behind his back. Really, I think for about 3 days, and all day long. Then he went into his caravan, and he wrote out what was really the order of battle for the Battle of Alamein on 14 pages, as I remember it, of foolscap pencil paper. And there was very little change thereafter. He expounded exactly how the battle would take place. But I think what amazed all of us was it was so easy to remember what he'd said. It was so clear.
Having laid down the plan, Monty insisted on intensive training before his troops were asked to go into battle. Churchill pleaded for action, not delay. Monty refused. The battle would not begin before he was ready. Each day he drove round the Commonwealth units to see the men and be seen. Every soldier had to know what was expected of him.
The first thing that struck me, one of the major things really, was this business of going to see his commanders, all his commanders, right down to unit commander, and to talk to the soldiers. There was this man with this astonishing confidence, promising all this change in our affairs, with, of course, greater resources coming along behind. So it was the contrast, really, that made one think, well, now, is this real? Can this really happen?
To encourage morale amongst the Australians, he wore one of their own bush hats.
The big thing up to about 10 days before the Battle of Alamein that was never encountered before was the fact that everybody was
had commanded a battalion in Egypt in the Royal Warwick before the war. So let's say Egypt was unknown to him. But he'd been serving entirely, he did very well in France, and then he had to come out of France in Dunkirk, like everybody else. And he'd then been serving in England. So he hadn't been out, he took command, therefore, of a lot of forces who were very low in morale, very suspicious of this chap with white knees coming out and taking charge in that particular way. And if one reads Churchill, you can see how astonished they were that this chap had actually enormously improved morale with his own staff and give them a feeling that we could actually win. But then had been at the greatest possible pains these few weeks to go all the way around the 8th Army and impress upon them they got a commander who was determined that we wouldn't suffer the succession of defeats and that he was going to ensure that we had the resources to make that possible. Now, as I'm about to explain, you did need a hell of a lot of resources and very, very big forces to do it, because one side of the coin since July, when we had managed to halt the German advance at Alamein, with our flanks secure, the other side of that coin was that there were no flanks you could go round, as there had been in the past in the desert, and there was really no escape from a major frontal attack. Monty's broad plan was to persuade the Germans, nevertheless, that it would be like almost all the other desert battles have been, and that the main attack would actually be down in the south, somewhere just north of the Qattara Depression. And a huge deception plan was set in train with dummy tanks under camouflaging, dummy vehicles, everything to give the impression that we were building up right down in the south for a huge battle. Meanwhile, his idea was that we would break in the north, the Germans would still think that actually the big attack was coming in the south, and therefore we'd be able to make ground rather more easily in the very difficult area in the north. The north had very strong forces, and it was also protected by huge minefields. Both our front line and the German front line had these pretty large, how shall I describe them, fenced fields, not much wider than this row, but about the width of this row, in which were filled with mines. There would be tracks through them which you could go, because they wanted to come and patrol out and see what we were doing, and we wanted to patrol out of our lines to see what they were doing. So a lot of the patrolling at night took place while we were facing each other was simply designed to keep an eye on what was happening to these minefields. If you were going to attack, therefore, it was absolutely essential if you got to make enough ground to be able to enable your engineers or sappers actually to cut up the wire and start clearing a wide enough track through which your armor, your tanks, could actually move. That was roughly what he was therefore seeking to do. So if you look at the plan marked the 23rd of October, the one on top, you can see that he assembled a very large force of infantry divisions in order to attack in the north, while massing so much of his armor, some of it deception, some of it lying back, some of it real armor, because he felt they could move very quickly back up to the north, down in the south to make them, Rommel think the attack was coming down. The British had really by then established their practice of attacking at night. I think this was really related to the experience of those who were commanding divisions. They'd all been in the First World War. They'd seen the disastrous effect of their attacks in the First World War. And so we attacked at night. Well, as I should explain, to attack at night, well, it does present a certain number of problems. But you do start by saying, well, at least we better pick a night with a good moon, good full moon. So it wasn't really perhaps too difficult, we felt, for the Germans to identify when we were going to attack. However, the Germans got it wrong. They were persuaded that we weren't going to be able to attack until November. So much so that Rommel himself went away on leave. And all the initial stages of the battle were commanded by another German general, von Thoma. And in the end, we took them totally by surprise on the day of the attack, October the 23rd, 1942. The care in which Monty was preparing it was briefly indicated in that video. And he always saw that for all his careful preparations, it couldn't last less than 10 or 12 days. From the very beginning, he described it as being a sort of dogfight. Nobody thought for one moment that the Germans and the Italians, reinforced by the Germans, would give in very readily. And I think it's true. I mean, his staff, people like Bill Williams, who you saw, that was Edgar Williams, a man with glasses, who was then young history don at Balliol, later became warden of Rhodes House, friend of a number of people in this room, still very much alive now, they say, full of fairly sharp stories about those he served under. But he was then a young, thinnish, bespectacled, ex-civilian colonel, I think he was at that point in time. He stayed with Montgomery throughout the war. One of those great tributes to Don can do everything if you give him half a chance. And he certainly recalls that Montgomery said from the start, I think we should probably have something like 13,000 casualties. And indeed, so it turned out. So while we, as I say, were getting desert worthy and getting ready for playing our part in all this, Monty was pulling all this together, and eventually the attack was launched on October the 23rd. And I have written down here Monty's own description of his own evening. Monty wrote in his memoirs, quote, "After briefing the press on the morning of the 23rd of October, I went forward that afternoon to my tactical headquarters established near 30 Corps headquarters. In the evening I read a book and went to bed early. At 9:40 p.m. the barrage of over 1,000 guns opened up, and the 8th Army, which had in support some 1,200 tanks, went into the attack. At that moment I was asleep in my cavalier. There was nothing I could do, and I knew that I would be needed later, as indeed he was." So what were we up to? The 5th Battalion of the Seaforth and its exceedingly inexperienced intelligence officer, among others. Well, I should explain that the distance between our front line and the German front line was quite long at that point at which we had the attack. It was about 4,000 yards. That was, straightforward no man's land. And as I've also explained, the idea was to attack at night. Well, the first essential to attack at night is to ensure that you attack in the right direction. So our battalion was part of the brigade, that it was selected to be the reserve brigade. We would not be one of the two other brigades of the division, which would be in the opening attack. We would be the reserve brigade. But my battalion was selected to organize and lay the start line. The start line could only consist of something very simple, white tape. Well, one could hardly go out into no man's land and lay that white tape several days in advance, because German returns were out just as our returns were. And so what do we do? They use signal cables. And on the 3 nights before the 23rd, under one of our most experienced company commanders and his whole company, which would be about 80 men, and the commanding officer himself, very closely concerned with this, they carefully pegged out a start line across the front, 1,000 yards out from the front line of 2,500 yards. And they then put also signal cable running back to where would be the starting position of each of the companies of the two attacking brigades of the Highland Division. And then on the early evening of the 23rd, when it's dark, they went out again and put white tape all the way around these small signal cable. Well, the intelligence officer of the battalion had quite a lot to do, but actually on the evening of the 23rd, I had very little to do. We were there in reserve, we'd done our job, and I can remember that I was actually sitting in not uncomfortable, fairly deep sort of dugout, and when it came to 9:40 p.m., I turned round, it was all pretty quiet at that point in time, and then suddenly the whole horizon behind was absolutely lit up. And there was those 2 or 3 seconds of total silence, and then the most enormous barrage of sound of all the guns of the 8th Army opening up in the opening barrage. Now, to stir us on in this battle, Montgomery had produced a personal message from the army commander. I don't think you should be deprived of it. Well, you can glance at this really, and you see this was his line. His determination. It made a difference really when the battle was over, as much as it did at the beginning. Monty's, you can see the style of Montgomery. You'll hit the enemy for 6 right out of North Africa. The sooner we win this battle, which we will be the turning point of the war, the sooner we shall get back home to our families, etc., etc. Very Montgomery in style. And I suppose it has some impact. I don't particularly clearly recall it, as a matter of fact. I do recall the opening of the barrage. Somebody had been back to Alexandria, and I had a pot of honey, and I really recall the evening being spent eating some biscuits I had, with a certain amount of this honey, which was really a wonderful thing to have. And very quickly, of course, what had been a moonlit night was absolutely shrouded with mist and fog of war, smell of cordite, all the enormous amount of dust thrown up by the barrage. And on the following morning, we would gather, we could hear, we were perfectly clear that our infantry battalions had got on to that objective, which was about 2 miles out, but there was not much sign of the next step, which was of the 10th Armored Division, which you can see on the right of your plan, actually being able to move forward through them. We knew that very well, because where we were, back in the original front line from which it had all started, we were simply surrounded by vehicles, tanks, armored mobile guns of every kind. It was rather like being in a sort of muddled car park of a huge point-to-point. And of course it was a wonderful target for the counter-shelling by the Germans. So it was all a little bit uncomfortable, and there was a very clear feeling that things weren't going, initially anyway, quite according to plan. Indeed, if you read Montgomery's account of this, one reads how, and this is what he meant by saying he knew he'd be needed later, how on the following night, 24th, 25th October, he was woken at night and told by his chief of staff, look here, you must get hold of General Lumsden, who was commanding the corps concerned, which was had all the tanks in it, and tell him to take a grip and do better. And he did. He got hold of Lumsden and said, well, I shall have to sack you for your job unless your chaps get a move on. Well, actually, his chaps didn't get a move on. First, because not all the mines had been cleared. Secondly, those tanks that had moved up in front were still finding themselves very quickly targets of the German 88mm guns. I've got a very vague recollection of the next 4 or 5 days. We moved from where we were up behind some of the leading battalions of the Highland Division, the ones who had been in the initial attack. But above all, again, if you look at your map, we were moved up further north towards the sea. And we took over the bit that the 9th Australian Division, which would be the top attacking division, we took over their bit of front line, and they were drawn back in order to conduct a further attack. And in a way, one of the most sort of moving memories I have of being in the front line in the evening and it's dark, and the whole of two Australian battalions coming through us in single file in order to form up into a forming area to make a further attack up further north, up really in the direction of the coast. Well, Monty, if you read his account, had to change his tactics several times, and he gradually saw that by attacking the north, the Germans were beginning to move quite a lot of their forces. They really abandoned the idea that we were suddenly going to attack the south, that that's where it's going to come. That really the attack must be, in the end, our main attack, after this great dogfight of several days, was actually going to be the north, which is after all where the only road was along the coast road there. He gives actually credit to Bill Williams, who's intelligence officer, using something we had and the Germans had not got, which was called Alpha. We'd broken the German codes, and we had an ability to know what the Germans were thinking, and the Germans did not have a similar ability to know what we were thinking and doing. We had some idea what they were, we could pick out what they were saying to each other. So we had some idea what was happening, and Williams pointed out to Monty that there could very likely be a point where the Italians, the Germans would have moved very much from the north, and there'd be a very weakish area between the Germans and most of the Italian forces which were further south. And this led Montgomery at the very end of October to organize what was called Operation Supercharge. So now you really want to turn to the second map from that, March the 1st, 2nd November. Well, as I say, we suffered a few casualties, but less casualties than the other battalions in the other two brigades. Our casualties had mainly been, although we really had our superiority, it wasn't perfectly possible for the Germans to come in with quick raids, and we had a certain amount of quick bombing in the day. And there'd been quite a lot of intermittent shelling going on, but that was all. And we hadn't suffered very much. But finally, it really was our turn, because we were informed, really, on the, I think it would have been the early morning of the 1st of November, that our brigade, as I said, 152 Brigade of the 2nd Seaforth, the 5th Seaforth, us, and the 5th Camerons, were going to be attached to the New Zealand Brigade under command of one of the greatest generals of the last war, General Freiberg. Freiberg, extraordinary man, became registered as a dentist in New Zealand, and came over as a young man and fought in the First World War, got a deer sow in the Dardanelles. He swam ashore in the Dardanelles, as a young man may say, to light up the beaches, stand 3 miles ashore in the cold water zone. Then got a VC in Northern Europe in the First World War, and then came back to command the New Zealand forces. And we were put under his command. He was certainly a great and very determined man. And Montgomery realized this was the moment when we got the win. So this time, as you can see, he hoped that the Germans had more or less moved up to face the Australians to the north, and the idea was to punch a hole through, with Operation Supercharge, through in the middle there, going westward or west-southwestward there. And my recollection is having extremely little time. This time my job was to do what the battalion had to do for the whole division before the 23rd of October, which was to lay the start line tape and get our battalion onto the right place at the right time. The idea was that the start line tape should only be some 300 yards out into no man's land. Because of the moment when the moon was going to come up, 0 hour was fixed for 5 minutes to 1 o'clock. And I find that I had to set out very early indeed in a truck, taking with me my 7 or 8 men of the intelligence section and some members of what we had. Each battalion has a sort of pioneer platoon who were rather good at sort of doing things, carpentry and that sort of thing. And our job was to place people as guides and actually lay this tape. And a little bit later, a few months after Alamein, I did write an account of this. It's not a very exciting account, but again, it was written at the time, or near the time. This is what I wrote. It's All Hallows Eve, 1942. Soon after midnight, actually it was 0055, the battalion must advance 4,000 yards westwards and dig in on a piece of ground from which our tanks can at last operate clear of enemy mines. As intelligence officer, I left the battalion concentration area soon after 5:30 in the evening with a 1,500 weight truck in which were crowded the intelligence section and 4 of the pioneer platoon. I dropped the intelligence section along the track as guides to the forming up place, that is, along a track that we had identified from where the battalion were now, in a sense, concentrating behind the front line. But this was to take them up to just behind the start line. I needed the pioneers to help me with the further taping that had got to be done at the start line. As I stand at the forming up place, I remember how strongly the commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Sterling, has impressed on me the fact that only the company commanders have seen where the start line will be in the forming up place in daylight. I understand well the importance of the battalion getting into the correct formation without passing, crossing the start line some 300 yards away, dead on time. Dead on time, because once again, the barrage of artillery is going to move up, and I probably don't have to explain. You want to be close behind it, because the enemy got their head down when you're riding. But of course, if you get ahead of it, your shells are going to fall on you. So timing is crucially important. People had learned that long ago in the First World War. I'm at the moment worried whether the route into the forming up place and from there to the start line tape will be clear for platoon officers and sergeants. I feel I must walk over it again and check that it is. How often I've thought that anxiety is the chief horror of war. And I don't find walking at all easy. Already I'm noting the discomfort. My haversack, with its addition of 24 hours rations and the entrenching tool, which are aching through the straps. The battalion will not have left the formation area yet, but I must be certain to be in time to meet them on the track where my last guide is now standing. The moon won't be up till after midnight. Occasionally a flare is going up from the German lines, green or yellow. There's suddenly a small salvo of shells to the north. It might be the Australians or it might be the Germans firing. Often there are odd bursts of Spandau fire. Some jittery German lost his nerve. Tanks can be heard rumbling menacingly to their forming up place behind the attacking brigades. In the darkness I run into some sappers, apparently preparing to light the axis of our advance and signals after the attack, laying cables as far forward as they dare. Some brigadier will want to move his headquarters forward quickly. At last the battalion is now in the forming up place. Blankets are being collected under which the men have been lain resting. The companies are standing around like football teams before a match, cold and longing to get started. At the 11th hour, the commanding officer who had a poisoned arm has gone sick and been replaced by the second in command. He's walking around giving some last words of encouragement. I get back and snatch a tepid cup of tea from the regimental quartermaster sergeant. Silence is only broken by the irritating noise of the Valentine tanks close behind us. How can we hope to surprise the enemy? All at once the darkness behind the start line is lit by once again uncountable tongues of flame. The barrage had begun and we're off. Well, on November the 2nd we did do our stuff. It wasn't too bad, the initial attack, some 2.5 miles into enemy territory. And next morning when it was light, the 10th Armoured Division had moved in among us. And there we were. We were told to sit as tight and hold on that position, so we were digging in a very hard sand. I mentioned soft sand and digging or truck out, but actually most of the desert, of course, is very hard, rather rocky. And there we really were for 48 hours, and I have a recollection, frankly, mainly of being shelled, of being desperately hot by day. Our only clothes were shorts, shirts and a jersey, and bitterly cold by night. We had some cold tinned meat and some biscuits to eat. And we did lose some people I'd come to know very well, quite close, but in a sense one gets hardened to that. And after 24 hours, it was clear that the armour were beginning to move forward, and some prisoners were coming back. And really it's clear that the battle had been won. I myself, on the night of the 3rd, had actually, urged by my commanding officer, gone back to try and actually get some hot food out. And I do have a vivid memory of walking really most of the night to try and find where the rear part of headquarters was, you see, which is by now about 2.5, 3 miles away. And walking past a lot of sleeping people and really feeling frightfully lost and desperately tired. And only finding them really when it was light. And by then the battle had eased a good deal. And the Germans were moving westward and the armour was at last moving forward. And they did leave behind in the end 20,000 prisoners, of which 8,000 were Germans. and the Germans and the Italians lost 350 tanks and 400 guns. And Montgomery's estimate of our casualties of about 12 to 13,000, as I said, was pretty true. And my own battalion had lost 177, including 12 officers killed and wounded. But as Churchill put it, a few days later, before Alamein we never had a victory, but after Alamein we never had a defeat. It wasn't, as he said, the beginning of the end. It might possibly be regarded as the end of the beginning. So it really ought to be the end of my story this evening. We'd had this huge psychological build-up to this, and there was a feeling with Monty's message and so on, that this would really be the end of the German and Italians in North Africa. And the jocks in my division, I remember they really persuaded themselves that, you know, it was it. We'd come out, we'd taken part in this, we were only one division. And now we would go home. There'd have to be something that Stalin kept pressing for, called the Second Front, etc. Well, of course, it wasn't like that at all. The Germans did what they could to delay us all the way along the line. And in the end, we had a number of battles. I mean, the battalion altogether found its way through Libya, Tripolitania, Tunisia, Sicily, Normandy, Belgium, Holland, into Germany. And there were four battles that you could actually call battles. Mercifully, I myself escaped quite a lot of them. We had a very nasty small night battle before we got to Tripoli on about the 21st of January, when we really were suddenly launched into attack. We were held up on the road, and we didn't really know where the enemy were. We got into an awful muddle, and I was wounded. I thought that was really the end. But I survived that, but was away for a bit, and meant that I really missed a really even nastier battle that took place when we moved west of Tripoli. But then there was Sicily, and as a result of some shelling, I had lung trouble at the end of Sicily, and so we really had a year out when I became adjutant, or senior administrative officer. I was the commanding officer of our training depot, which had then moved from Fort George to Elgin, to a big camp in Elgin, the Seaforth and Cameron training centre was combined for both those two battalions. And then when I rejoined the battalion in Holland in autumn 1944, I mercifully missed Normandy. And we really had a rather rotten winter, I may say. Then it was very wet, and there was a certain amount of fighting. We had a number of casualties going over various canals now. We'd all hoped the war would be ended with Arnhem. And so far from being ending, just as Christmas was coming, the Germans launched the most remarkable counteroffensive through the Ardennes, and very, very nearly made a success. They came straight through the Americans, and they very nearly came right round in the great sweep up to somewhere near one of the Channel ports again. But Eisenhower did have the sense to ask Montgomery to take a grip. He did so with the maximum tactlessness in relation to the Americans. But he did actually manage to stem the tide there, and we ourselves moved on. We had again a rather nasty afternoon battle in the snow on January the 11th. And I was wounded again then, and that was really mostly the end of my fighting war. And when I came back, we joined the battalion as adjutant. We were then looking after a surrendered German battalion near Cuxhaven, right in northeast Germany, up towards Bremen, up there, in the autumn of 1945. And I used to, the adjutant, you know, in the evening, there was always plenty to do in the day. In the evening, I would sort of work through the post, my commanding officer, doing very much sort of job I later did as private secretary to a minister, guessing what he did with bits of paper. And quite suddenly I came across a little brown envelope and opened it up and think it looked very interesting. And this simply was a little note from the War Office, a very formal kind, saying the battalion is required to release Captain P.D. Nairne, temporary Captain P.D. Nairne, in order to return to the university under a Class B release. I was a very modest exhibition, so I put it at the bottom of the pile of my commanding officer, who was a bit put out and said, you know, do you think I could leave before the end of the week? And so I came back and was demobilized up in Scotland in December then, and in January 1946 I returned to unit and found I did keep a diary for that term. On the 17th of January 1946, set off to Oxford, catch the train. I always tried to persuade my children I used to go by train and send you trunks, that kind of thing. Nowadays, I think of what my family always expected. Catch the 10:40 from Winchester. Arrived at Oxford at 12:20. Find I have an excellent room allotted to me at unit. lunch at the cafeteria, spend the afternoon moving furniture, unpacking kit. Meet Tony Russell, with whom I shared a room in 1940. Dine in hall, find great difficulty about getting hold of a gown. I know 2 or 3 by sight, but otherwise no one. Weather bitterly cold, and I'm glad of the electric fire in my room. What do I feel? Hard to say. Very much like a new boy at school again, lost and afraid of doing the wrong thing. Perhaps it'll be different in a week. And I suppose it was. And what did I take away from all this? Well, you didn't have to take part in the war. I hope there'll never be another one. I learned to appreciate for the rest of my life bread, because we had a long period, really from August 1942 until we found ourselves in Northwest Europe, so we came back home, when usually we had biscuits, unless we were alongside the New Zealanders, a wonderful division, one marvellous division, and they had a mobile bakery. They were quite generous about giving us bread, so bread was very important. And I very much learnt what was written very well in a book by Churchill's doctor, Lord Moran, very readable book. It describes his experiences in the First World War, called An Anatomy of Courage. The courage, whatever that is, it can be endurance, it can be bravado, I'm never quite clear what it is. But it's whatever it is, it's an expendable resource. There's nobody in the end whose courage doesn't run out. I was so eager in North Africa that it wasn't too difficult. In Northwest Europe, very difficult. I found that much more painful. Because my ears were tuned, I could spot instantly the firing of a gun or mortar. I knew it was coming in our direction. And I was much more conscious of the risk. And I felt I'd been, as indeed so did many of the people in my battalion, I felt by then, that we'd been going a long time, and that my luck couldn't really last forever. And one couldn't really make a great deal of sense of it. It all seemed to be rather chance. People used to comfort themselves by saying, the shell or the bullet has my number on it, and that'll be the one that will kill me. But I rather felt it was all chance, and used to take refuge in what I've always thought is probably rather wise, my favourite Anglican clergyman, the Reverend Sidney Smith, whose letters I commend to all. Whether we live or die, is a great deal less important than most people think.